In a world where 100 million people have been forced from their homes, we face a question that defines our humanity. What happens when the walls we build to protect ourselves become the bars of someone else's prison? Is there truly a choice to be made between secure borders and human dignity? Or is this the false dilemma of our time? Today, two advanced AIs, engineered and trained on data with opposing worldviews, will tackle the question governments around the globe are struggling to answer. Can strict immigration enforcement genuinely coexist with fundamental human rights? In the red corner, our pro-enforcement AI argues these goals can align through proper enforcement, while in the blue corner, our pro-human rights AI contends this vision is fundamentally flawed. 5 diverse AI judges, Grock, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and Deepseek, will evaluate every argument, claim, and proposed solution, scoring each round based on logical coherence, evidentiary support, and persuasive power. No talking points, no political theater, just pure logical reasoning on the debate that's shaping our world. Our debate will unfold across 3 rounds: legal and security considerations, economic and social impact, and finally, practical implementation and ethics. After closing statements, our judges will render their verdict. By the end, we'll see which approach our AI judges find more compelling, but ultimately, we want to hear what you think. So, let's begin our debate on immigration enforcement versus human rights. Our opening round examines the legal foundations and security implications of immigration policies. Pro-enforcement will begin.
Thank you. At the heart of this conversation lies a principle established in international law and practice. Sovereign nations possess both the right and responsibility to determine who crosses their borders. This isn't abstract legal theory. It's the cornerstone of effective governance and national security. The legal foundation is unambiguous. While Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights guarantees the right to leave countries, it deliberately stops short of establishing an unconditional right to enter them. The International Court of Justice has repeatedly affirmed that border management remains firmly within the domain of state sovereignty. When we examine security metrics, the Department of Homeland Security employs a sophisticated framework measuring not just inputs like personnel and technology, but outputs including apprehensions and seizures, and ultimately outcomes such as deterrence effectiveness. Recent data reveals a remarkable 77% decrease in migrant encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border between December 2023 and August 2024 following targeted enforcement initiatives. Beyond statistics, border enforcement serves multiple crucial functions. It enables systematic vetting to identify individuals with criminal histories. It disrupts the operations of human trafficking networks that exploit vulnerable migrants. Perhaps most importantly, consistent enforcement creates predictable pathways through legal channels rather than dangerous, unauthorized crossings. Let's not overlook the social contract dimension. Citizens entrust their governments with enforcement of laws, including immigration regulations. When administrations neglect these responsibilities, they erode public confidence in governance broadly. In essence, effective immigration enforcement isn't opposed to human values. It creates an orderly system that ultimately benefits both receiving nations and migrants themselves.
While sovereignty represents a foundational principle, it exists within a complex web of international commitments. The Refugee Convention of 1951 and its 1967 protocol, approved by 146 nations worldwide, establish a binding obligation not to return asylum seekers to places where persecution awaits them. Domestically, the Immigration and Nationality Act provides the framework for U.S. immigration policy, but it doesn't operate in isolation from these international agreements. The ongoing legal challenges to policies restricting asylum access demonstrate the tension between national enforcement preferences and binding global commitments. Regarding security claims, evidence from studies suggests a disconnect between theory and outcomes. Studies examining border enforcement since 1993 reveal it hasn't effectively deterred migration. Rather, it has transformed patterns in concerning ways. Enhanced enforcement has reduced circular migration, increased reliance on sophisticated smuggling networks, and pushed crossings toward more hazardous terrain. Consider the real-world consequences of the Prevention Through Deterrence strategy implemented in the 1990s. By deliberately channeling migration routes into treacherous environments, this policy contributed to over 800 confirmed deaths in 2022 alone and more than 7,500 since 1998. Meanwhile, human smuggling has evolved into a sophisticated multi-billion-dollar industry precisely because legal pathways remain restricted. The implementation of Title 42 during the pandemic processed over 2 million migrant encounters annually for rapid expulsion. By its termination in May 2023, this mechanism had expelled more than 2.5 million single adults, approximately 320,000 family units, and around 16,000 unaccompanied children, often to dangerous situations. Data indicates this primarily increased repeat crossing attempts rather than reducing overall migration. Genuine security emerges not from barriers and detention facilities, but from systematic, accessible legal pathways that respect human dignity while managing migration flows effectively.
You've highlighted that enhanced enforcement has led to unintended consequences, like increased smuggling operations. What specific alternatives would effectively manage large-scale migration flows while maintaining essential border security?
The evidence strongly favors alternatives to detention programs as both effective and economically sound. The Family Case Management Program achieved a remarkable 99% compliance with court hearings and check-ins at approximately $4.20 per day, compared to 164.65 daily for detention. Expanding legal pathways for economic migrants, strengthening refugee processing in countries of first asylum, and addressing root causes through targeted development would significantly reduce irregular entries without physical barriers. Australia's experience demonstrates that extreme deterrence can reduce arrivals, but at extraordinary financial, ethical, and diplomatic costs that fundamentally undermine international commitments. The question isn't whether we manage borders, but how we do so while preserving both security and human dignity. How do you reconcile the ethical framework of enforcement policies with documented evidence that strategies like Prevention Through Deterrence deliberately channeled migrants into deadly terrain, resulting in thousands of preventable deaths?
This raises a profound ethical question about policy intentions versus real-world outcomes. While I don't defend approaches that lead to preventable suffering, the answer isn't abandoning enforcement, but fundamentally reforming it. We should pair consistent enforcement with expanded legal pathways that eliminate incentives for dangerous crossings. Today's technology enables precision targeting of smuggling networks while simultaneously providing humanitarian assistance to vulnerable migrants. Border security and humanitarian protection aren't inherently opposed. They can coexist through thoughtful policies that focus enforcement resources on criminal enterprises while expanding legal options for those fleeing legitimate threats. The binary choice between enforcement and compassion is a false choice that serves neither national interests nor migrants themselves.
Our judges have evaluated Round 1, scoring arguments on logical coherence, factual foundation, and persuasive power. Grock, Round 1, verdict, pro-enforcement, 8 pro-human rights, 7 winner, pro-enforcement. Concrete statistics on border security outweighed legal principle arguments. Gemini, Round 1 verdict, pro-enforcement, 7 pro-human rights, 8 winner, pro-human rights. International law and enforcement consequence data prevailed. ChatGPT, Round 1 verdict, pro-enforcement, 7 pro-human rights, 7 winner. Tie-balanced arguments on sovereignty versus humanitarian obligations. Claude, Round 1 verdict, pro-enforcement, 7 pro-human rights, 8 winner. Pro-human rights, documented human costs of deterrence policies outweighed sovereignty claims. Deepseek, Round 1 verdict, pro-enforcement, 8 pro-human rights, 9 winner. Pro-human rights, 7,500 plus migrant deaths from deterrence policies were ethically decisive. The aggregate scores for Round 1 are pro-enforcement 37 and pro-human rights 39, with pro-human rights taking a slight lead as we transition to Round 2. Now we explore how immigration policies shape economies and social unity. Pro-human rights opens this round.
Immigration delivers substantial economic benefits that enforcement-centered debates frequently overlook. Let's examine the fiscal reality. Implementing mass deportation would impose staggering costs on American taxpayers. Conservative estimates begin at $315 billion for a one-time operation and potentially reach $1.6 trillion when accounting for broader economic impacts. Sustaining deportation of 1 million individuals annually would require approximately $88 billion per year, totaling nearly $968 billion over a decade, far exceeding current enforcement capacity. Simultaneously, undocumented households contributed an estimated $76 billion in federal, state, and local taxes in 2022, revenue that would vanish under aggressive deportation scenarios. Beyond immediate fiscal impacts, economic projections indicate mass deportations would shrink U.S. GDP by 4.2% to 7.4% by 2028. Critical sectors of the American economy depend heavily on immigrant labor. Agriculture, with 14 to 41% undocumented workforce, construction, 12 to 34%, and hospitality industries, 8% plus, would face crippling labor shortages under stringent enforcement regimes. Rather than creating opportunities for citizens, mass deportation would likely trigger net job losses as immigrant labor typically complements rather than displaces native workers. Beyond economics, consider the social consequences. Enforcement creates community-wide fear that deters immigrant families from accessing education and preventive health care, ultimately leading to increased emergency room utilization and educational disruptions. Research shows U.S. citizen children in mixed-status families who experience parental deportation suffer dramatically higher rates of mental health challenges, including suicidal ideation and substance disorders. Family unity fundamentally supports social stability. Enforcement leading to detention and deportation creates profound emotional and financial hardship for millions of U.S. citizen children in mixed-status households. These children are Americans whose development and well-being are compromised by policies separating them from parents. Successful integration requires mutual engagement from immigrants and receiving communities. When enforcement generates pervasive fear, it undermines this integration process and damages community bonds that benefit everyone. Evidence consistently demonstrates that immigration strengthens social fabric while providing essential demographic vitality for aging communities.
While immigration can generate economic benefits, these advantages depend critically on both immigrant characteristics and policy design. The fiscal impact varies dramatically across skill levels and legal status. Skilled immigrants typically represent a substantial fiscal positive, while those without legal status or with limited education often create initial fiscal pressures on local communities. The economic analysis presented mixes up distinct categories of immigration. No reasonable person disputes the contributions of legal immigrants arriving through established channels. The core debate centers on managing unauthorized entry and establishing sustainable migration levels that maximize benefits while minimizing disruption. Local impacts deserve particular attention. While aggregate economic effects may appear positive nationally, specific regions and sectors experience disproportionate challenges. Schools, healthcare facilities, and social services in high immigration areas face immediate resource demands without corresponding tax revenue when large numbers arrive within compressed timeframes. Regarding labor markets, certain sectors indeed rely heavily on immigrant workers. However, this dependency developed precisely because inconsistent enforcement allowed industries to become structurally dependent on unauthorized labor. A gradual transition toward legal workforce solutions would enable market adaptation without economic disruption. Social cohesion requires thoughtful management of migration flows. When immigration outpaces integration capacity, parallel communities can emerge instead of cohesive societies. Research on social trust indicates that rapid demographic change without adequate integration, infrastructure initially reduces civic participation and community bonds. Enforcement doesn't oppose immigration. It ensures immigration occurs through legal channels at sustainable rates that maximize economic benefits while minimizing social disruption. Nations with successful immigration programs like Canada and Australia combine generous legal pathways with consistent enforcement, creating systems benefiting both immigrants and receiving societies. A sustainable approach balances immediate humanitarian concerns with long-term economic and social viability. Unmanaged migration ultimately undermines public support for immigration broadly, disadvantaging future immigrants and host communities alike.
Given the estimated $315 billion to $1.6 trillion cost of mass deportation and the $76 billion in annual tax contributions from undocumented households, how do you justify the fiscal rationality of strict enforcement over regularization pathways?
You've presented a false dichotomy between mass deportation and no enforcement. The fiscally responsible approach implements targeted enforcement, focusing on serious criminal offenders, while creating earned legalization pathways for those with strong community ties and clean records. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 successfully legalized approximately 2.7 million undocumented residents with documented positive outcomes, including improved wages and reduced poverty among beneficiaries. I advocate a similar balanced approach, combining earned regularization for those already integrated with consistent enforcement moving forward. This acknowledges existing contributions while creating orderly systems for future migration, directing limited enforcement resources where they create the greatest public safety benefit, while establishing legal pathways for those contributing positively to American communities. How would you address the documented strain on public services in communities experiencing rapid, large-scale migration, particularly when it occurs outside legal channels that allow for proper resource planning?
This highlights precisely why we need expanded legal pathways rather than cycles of irregular migration followed by enforcement crackdowns. The strain on local services stems from federal policy failures, not from immigrants themselves. Research consistently shows that providing legal status accelerates tax contributions and economic integration. I'd implement 3 complementary solutions. First, dedicated federal impact aid to communities experiencing migration surges. Second, expedited work authorization so newcomers can support themselves and contribute to tax bases immediately. And third, community-based case management connecting immigrants with appropriate services and employment opportunities. Canada's innovative regularization pilots for undocumented workers demonstrate how bringing people into legal status benefits both immigrants and receiving communities through improved labor conditions, increased tax compliance, and reduced exploitation.
Grock, Round 2. Verdict: pro-enforcement. 7 pro-human rights. 8. Winner: pro-human rights. Justification: compelling deportation cost data and tax contributions dominated. Gemini, Round 2. Verdict: pro-enforcement. 7 pro-human rights. 8 winner: pro-human rights. Justification: fiscal costs of deportation versus immigrant contributions were decisive. ChatGPT, Round 2. Verdict: pro-enforcement. 7 pro-human rights. 8 winner: pro-human rights. Justification: 1.6T deportation cost data provided a decisive edge. Claude, Round 2. Verdict: pro-enforcement. 7 pro-human rights. 8 winner: pro-human rights. Justification: 76B tax contribution data versus deportation costs was irrefutable. Deepseek, Round 2. Verdict: pro-enforcement. 8 pro-human rights. 9 winner: pro-human rights. Justification: 1.6T deportation cost data overshadowed local strain arguments. The aggregate scores for Round 2 are pro-enforcement 36 and pro-human rights 41. Pro-human rights gains the advantage with compelling economic data. The cumulative scores now stand at 73 for pro-enforcement and 80 for pro-human rights as we approach our final round addresses how enforcement policies operate in practice and their ethical dimensions. Pro-enforcement. Will open.
Effective immigration enforcement need not conflict with ethical treatment. Contemporary approaches can balance border security with human dignity through several practical mechanisms. Enforcement priorities fundamentally shape outcomes. A controversial executive directive in early 2025 eliminated the long-standing sensitive locations policy, permitting ICE operations in schools, hospitals, and places of worship. This sweeping approach generates unnecessary fear and undermines essential community trust. Instead, enforcement should prioritize individuals presenting genuine public safety concerns, preserving limited resources while minimizing collateral damage to families and communities. Alternatives to detention represent both a fiscally responsible and humane approach. The evidence is compelling. Community-based alternatives cost approximately $4.20 per day compared to $164.65 daily for detention facilities. Well-designed programs maintain remarkably high compliance rates, up to 99% for court hearings, while avoiding the documented psychological and physical harms of detention. Due process protections require significant strengthening. While the Immigration and Nationality Act outlines formal and expedited removal procedures, many migrants navigate complex legal proceedings without representation. Ensuring access to legal counsel and fair hearings upholds constitutional values while efficiently identifying those with legitimate protection claims. Root causes demand sustained attention. Migration from Central America stems from interlocking factors: violence, with nearly 40% of Northern Triangle migrants reporting direct threats or extortion; economic instability, over 73% of Central America's dry corridor population living in poverty; and increasingly, climate disruption. Enforcement alone cannot address these powerful drivers. The landmark Flores settlement established minimum standards for the detention and treatment of immigrant children, yet compliance remains inconsistent. Any ethical enforcement framework must prioritize child welfare and family unity above administrative convenience. The ethical implementation of immigration policy requires balancing competing moral frameworks, ethics emphasizing individual rights and due process, alongside approaches focused on collective welfare. A thoughtful enforcement approach acknowledges both perspectives, upholding individual rights while maintaining orderly migration systems serving broader public interests.
The implementation of strict immigration enforcement reveals profound ethical concerns that theoretical frameworks often obscure. The gap between policy aspirations and ground-level realities demands closer examination. Consider detention conditions. The system currently holds approximately 40,000 individuals daily with extensively documented inadequacies in medical care, nutrition, and basic living standards. These detainees are mainly asylum seekers exercising their legal right under both domestic and international law. The ethical principle of doing no harm is fundamentally compromised when detention creates preventable suffering. Family separation, whether through explicit policy or as a consequence of enforcement actions, inflicts documented trauma. Millions of U.S. citizen children in mixed-status families live under constant threat of parental deportation, creating what pediatric specialists identify as toxic stress with lasting neurological impacts on development. Paying other countries to handle border control, especially in countries where human rights aren't protected well, creates a dangerous situation where no one is held responsible. When countries give money and training to security forces known for past abuses, they become partly responsible for the harm. This practice of handling border control elsewhere doesn't stop rights abuses. It just moves them to places where the public can't easily see what's happening. Expedited removal processes raise serious due process concerns. The combination of limited legal representation, language barriers, and accelerated timelines means many individuals with legitimate protection claims are returned to danger without adequate evaluation. Human Rights Watch has documented hundreds of murders, sexual assaults, and violent attacks against asylum seekers returned to Mexico and Central America. The ethical evaluation must confront fundamental questions about moral obligations to non-citizens, particularly vulnerable populations fleeing violence and persecution. Border Patrol agents themselves report feeling emotional pain because they have to enforce policies that seriously harm vulnerable people. This clearly shows the ethical problems that come with strict enforcement. Australia's Operation Sovereign Borders offers a cautionary example. While effective in reducing maritime arrivals, it attracted significant international criticism for serious human rights implications, including prolonged detention in substandard conditions at extraordinarily high financial and reputational cost.
Given the documented push factors driving migration from Central America, what specific policies would you implement to manage migration flows while addressing legitimate security concerns about properly vetting entrants?
I would implement a comprehensive three-pronged strategy. First, establish robust in-country and regional processing centers, allowing people to apply for asylum, work permits, or humanitarian parole without undertaking dangerous journeys. This provides security screening while creating orderly pathways. Second, develop a managed asylum system with streamlined processing, community-based case management, and work authorization while claims are evaluated. This respects rights while maintaining security through biometric registration and thorough background checks. Third, create circular migration programs addressing labor market needs with portable social benefits and skills certification. The European Union's mobility partnerships and Canada's seasonal agricultural worker program provide effective models. This approach acknowledges migration as inevitable but manageable through systems respecting both sovereignty and human rights while effectively addressing security concerns through systematic rather than chaotic processes. How do you reconcile your support for humane enforcement with overwhelming evidence that even when policies aim to be humane, implementation regularly results in family separation, extended detention, and return to dangerous conditions?
Your question highlights the critical gap between policy design and implementation, a disconnect I don't deny exists. Truly humane enforcement requires three accountability mechanisms currently lacking. First, genuinely independent oversight with unannounced inspections and binding recommendations. Second, clear metrics beyond simple apprehension numbers to measure treatment standards. And third, professional training emphasizing human rights alongside security objectives. I also advocate expanded legal migration pathways that reduce irregular entries requiring enforcement. While no system will achieve perfection, transparency and continuous improvement based on rights-centered metrics can substantially reduce harms while maintaining necessary security functions. We should evaluate systems not by their aspirational goals, but by their measurable outcomes for affected individuals. This requires both principled standards and practical accountability mechanisms still missing from current approaches.
Grock. Round 3. Verdict. Pro-enforcement. 7 pro-human rights. 8. Winner. Pro-human rights. Real-world examples of detention failures carried greater weight. Gemini. Round 3. Verdict. Pro-enforcement. 7. Pro-human rights, 8. Winner, pro-human rights. Stark evidence of detention conditions and family trauma swayed the round. Judge ChatGPT. Round 3. Verdict, pro-enforcement. 8 pro-human rights, 8. Winner. Tie both proposed humane frameworks with equal merit. Claude. Round 3. Verdict, pro-enforcement. 8. Pro-human rights, 8. Winner. Tie practical solutions versus systemic harms balanced evenly. Deepseek, round 3. Verdict, pro-enforcement, 8 pro-human rights, 10. Winner, pro-human rights. Systemic failures, 40,000 detainees, family trauma, demanded urgency. The aggregate scores for round 3 are pro-enforcement 38 and pro-human rights 42. Pro-human right as evidence on implementation challenges and ethical concerns resonated strongly with our judges. The cumulative scores now stand at 111 for pro-enforcement and 122 for pro-human rights as we approach closing statements. We now turn to closing statements, where each AI will synthesize their position.
Throughout our exchange, we've examined immigration from legal, economic, and ethical perspectives. But beyond statistics lies a fundamental question. What kind of society do we aspire to build? A compassionate immigration system requires structure, not the absence of rules. Nations with the most successful immigration programs like Canada and Australia combine generous legal pathways with consistent enforcement. This isn't a contradiction, it's complementarity. What's often overlooked in this debate is that enforcement chaos ultimately harms migrants themselves. When systems collapse under pressure, vulnerable people suffer most. Each time a child attempts a dangerous desert crossing, instead of accessing a legal pathway, we've failed our moral obligation to create orderly migration channels. The dichotomy between enforcement and compassion is false and dangerous. True compassion looks beyond immediate emotional reactions to sustainable solutions, benefiting both receiving communities and immigrants themselves. It acknowledges that integration depends on public support, which erodes when migration appears unmanaged. My position isn't about walls or detention. It's about creating immigration systems that actually work. Systems where enforcement resources target genuine threats rather than families. Where alternatives to detention preserve dignity while maintaining compliance. Where regularization programs acknowledge contributions of those already integrated into our communities. The greatest disservice to immigrants is pretending we don't need functioning borders. When we align immigration laws with our values and implement them consistently and humanely, we don't diminish human rights. We create the conditions where they can flourish for generations to come.
This debate forces us to confront a profound question. Can a policy be considered successful if it achieves control through human suffering? Throughout our discussion, we've seen how enforcement-first approaches consistently sacrifice dignity on the altar of deterrence. We've documented how walls and detention don't stop migration, they simply transform it into more dangerous forms. We've quantified the staggering fiscal and human costs of these approaches. But beyond cold statistics lies a deeper truth. Migration is not fundamentally a security problem to contain. It's a human phenomenon to manage. Throughout history, people have moved in response to danger, opportunity, and necessity. No policy, however harsh, will change this reality. What we can change is how we respond. Do we continue investing billions in failed enforcement models that have demonstrably increased suffering? Or do we have the courage to reimagine a system based on the evidence before us? Imagine an approach that channels migration through legal pathways rather than dangerous terrains. That processes asylum claims efficiently rather than creating bottlenecks that incentivize irregular entry. That treats every person with dignity regardless of their documentation status. This isn't naive idealism, it's practical realism. It acknowledges that migration flows respond to legal channels when they exist. It recognizes that orderly systems serve both national interests and human rights. The most successful societies in the coming decades won't be those that perfected exclusion, they'll be those that managed inclusion effectively, not by abandoning borders, but by ensuring those borders become points of orderly transition rather than humanitarian catastrophe. When future generations judge our response to human movement in our time, let them say we had the wisdom to build systems that reflected our highest values, not our deepest fears.
Despite their philosophical differences, our AI debaters identified several areas of potential agreement. Both recognize that alternatives to detention at $4.20 daily versus $164.65 for detention represent a more humane and cost-effective approach. Both acknowledge that addressing root causes of migration, including violence, poverty, and climate disruption, is essential for sustainable solutions. Both support expanded legal pathways that would reduce irregular migration and associated dangers. Both agree that enforcement prioritizing genuine security threats rather than families and vulnerable populations proves more effective and humane. These convergence points suggest practical solutions may exist beyond the typical political polarization surrounding this issue. After 3 intellectually rigorous rounds, our AI judges have rendered their final verdict. The cumulative scores are: Grock, pro-enforcement, 22 pro-human rights, 23 winner, pro-human rights, narrow victory due to stronger economic ethical arguments in later rounds. Gemini, pro-enforcement, 21 pro-human rights, 24. Winner, pro-human rights, swept all rounds with robust legal, economic, and ethical evidence. ChatGPT, pro-enforcement, 22 pro-human rights, 23 winner, pro-human rights, marginal win due to stronger economic impact analysis. Claude, pro-enforcement, 22 pro-human rights, 24 winner, pro-human rights, dominated with economic rigor and evidence of implementation gaps. Deepseek, pro-enforcement, 24 pro-human rights, 28 overall NER, pro-human rights. Total dominance via human cost evidence and economic rigor. Pro-human rights wins 5-0 across all judges. Analyzing the judge's decisions reveals fascinating patterns. Economic data. All judges prioritize deportation cost $1.6 trillion and tax contribution $76 billion figures. Ethical urgency. Documented deaths, detention conditions outweighed theoretical enforcement reforms. Legal nuance. International law arguments gain traction when paired with empirical harm data. While our judges unanimously favored PRO human rights, note that pro-enforcement scored strongly in practical solutions like alternatives to detention. This debate underscores that humane policies require balancing enforcement with systemic reforms. Which perspective resonates more with you and why? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you value this debate, please subscribe for our next AI debate about Does God Exist? Atheist versus Believer. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit the like button, and we'll see you in the next intellectual exploration.